The Burning Fortress. October 12, 1943. High above the Rhineland, at 23,000 feet, the sky looked deceptively calm. From a distance, the formation of heavy bombers appeared almost peaceful. Hundreds of silver aircraft gliding through the thin air like a migrating flock of steel birds. But inside those aircraft, there was nothing peaceful about the mission. The engines of the B-17 Flying Fortress roared constantly, a deep metallic thunder that vibrated through every rib of the aircraft. The bomber bearing tail number 42-3067 was part of the massive formation heading back toward England after a brutal bombing mission over Germany. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes gripped the control yoke tightly. His knuckles were pale from the pressure. The mission had already been long and violent, but Hayes believed the worst part might finally be over. He was wrong. Without warning, a flash of fire streaked past the right wing. A split second later, boom! The aircraft lurched violently. A 20mm cannon shell from a German fighter slammed directly into engine number 3 on the right wing. The explosion ripped through the engine cowling. Metal fragments tore through the engine casing. Oil sprayed outward like black rain. Inside the cockpit, warning lights exploded to life across the instrument panel. The bomber shuddered violently. Hayes felt the control yoke kick in his hands, as if the airplane itself were trying to escape his grip. "Engine 3 hit!" shouted co-pilot Lieutenant Frank Morrison. Outside the window, thick black smoke poured from the damaged engine. Flames licked across the cowling. The aircraft's nose dropped sharply. 15 degrees. The bomber began losing altitude immediately. Behind the cockpit, in the radio room, Sergeant Mike Donnelly watched in horror as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the fuselage wall. The fluid burst from a ruptured line like blood from a severed artery. Donnelly wiped his face and stared at the spreading red warning lights above the radio panel. The bomber was dying, and they were still 140 miles from England. Above the bomber, a few thousand feet higher, another pilot saw everything happen. First Lieutenant James Howell rolled his P-47 Thunderbolt sharply to the right as he spotted the wounded bomber dropping out of formation. His aircraft, the Burning Fortress. October 12, 1943. High above the Rhineland, at 23,000 feet, the sky looked deceptively calm. From a distance, the formation of heavy bombers appeared almost peaceful. Hundreds of silver aircraft gliding through the thin air like a migrating flock of steel birds. But inside those aircraft, there was nothing peaceful about the mission. The engines of the B-17 Flying Fortress roared constantly, a deep metallic thunder that vibrated through every rib of the aircraft. The bomber bearing tail number 42-3067 was part of the massive formation heading back toward England after a brutal bombing mission over Germany. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes gripped the control yoke tightly. His knuckles were pale from the pressure. The mission had already been long and violent, but Hayes believed the worst part might finally be over. He was wrong. Without warning, a flash of fire streaked past the right wing. A split second later, boom! The aircraft lurched violently. A 20mm cannon shell from a German fighter slammed directly into engine number 3 on the right wing. The explosion ripped through the engine cowling. Metal fragments tore through the engine casing. Oil sprayed outward like black rain. Inside the cockpit, warning lights exploded to life across the instrument panel. The bomber shuddered violently. Hayes felt the control yoke kick in his hands, as if the airplane itself were trying to escape his grip. "Engine 3 hit!" shouted co-pilot Lieutenant Frank Morrison. Outside the window, thick black smoke poured from the damaged engine. Flames licked across the cowling. The aircraft's nose dropped sharply. 15 degrees. The bomber began losing altitude immediately. Behind the cockpit, in the radio room, Sergeant Mike Donnelly watched in horror as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the fuselage wall. The fluid burst from a ruptured line like blood from a severed artery. Donnelly wiped his face and stared at the spreading red warning lights above the radio panel. The bomber was dying, and they were still 140 miles from England. Above the bomber, a few thousand feet higher, another pilot saw everything happen. First Lieutenant James Howell rolled his P-47 Thunderbolt sharply to the right as he spotted the wounded bomber dropping out of formation. His aircraft, a massive fighter known as the Jersey Thunder, carried the name proudly painted beneath the cockpit. Howell was only 24 years old. He was a farm boy from New Jersey, but war had turned him into something else entirely. He had already flown 72 combat missions over Europe, more than 300 combat hours. He had seen bombers burn. He had seen crews bail out, and he knew exactly what happened to aircraft that fell behind the formation. Stragglers rarely made it home. Howell banked hard, diving toward the crippled bomber. Below him, the massive formation of B-17s continued forward without hesitation. That was standard procedure. Stopping the formation to protect a single damaged aircraft would put hundreds of bombers at risk. Everyone knew the rule. If you couldn't keep up, you were on your own. Howell stared down at the smoking bomber. Then he reached for his radio switch. "Big friend," he said calmly, using the nickname fighter pilots often used for bombers. "This is Jersey 27. I have you in sight." Inside the damaged B-17 cockpit, Hayes heard the transmission through the intercom headset. He grabbed the microphone. "Jersey, we're losing hydraulics. Number 3 engine's on fire. We can't maintain altitude." Howell glanced at his fuel gauge. 58 minutes remaining, maybe less. The bomber was crawling through the sky at barely 140 knots. England was still 90 miles away. The math wasn't good, not for the bomber and not for him. But Howell didn't hesitate. "Copy that," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The mission that went wrong. The disaster had begun 6 hours earlier. At dawn, hundreds of American bombers had lifted off from Thorpe Abbott's airfield in England. It was the home of the legendary 100th Bomb Group. The target that day was the German industrial city of Schweinfurt, specifically the ball bearing factories that powered Germany's war machine. Destroy the bearings, and German tanks, aircraft, and vehicles would grind to a halt. At least that was the plan. But intelligence had been disastrously wrong. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. As the formation approached Germany, radar stations across the country tracked the incoming bombers. Within minutes, fighters began launching from airfields across the region. Messerschmitt Bf-110s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, hundreds of them. More than 400 German fighters swarmed into the sky. The air battle that followed was one of the most brutal of the entire war. The sky filled with tracer fire. Bombers exploded in mid-air. Parachutes blossomed everywhere. The American P-47 Thunderbolt escorts fought desperately to protect the bombers. But there was a problem. The P-47 had limited range. When the bombers crossed deep into German territory, the fighters had to turn back or risk running out of fuel. At the German border, many of the escort fighters peeled away. That's when the Luftwaffe attacked with full force. Hayes's bomber took its first damage during the bombing run itself. Heavy anti-aircraft fire, flak, exploded around the aircraft. A fragment punched through the fuselage near the ball turret. Inside the turret, Sergeant Eddie Martinez cried out. Shrapnel tore into his left shoulder. Blood soaked through his flight suit. Above him, the waist gunner, Corporal Tommy Briggs, was knocked unconscious when a piece of metal smashed into his helmet. Somehow, the steel helmet dented but didn't break. Briggs collapsed to the floor. Then the fighters arrived. 4 FW-190s dove from high above. Their wings flashed with cannon fire. The bomber shook as shells ripped through the airframe. Inside the top turret, gunner Paul Richter swung his twin 50-caliber machine guns toward the incoming fighters. He squeezed the trigger. The guns roared. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky. They slammed directly into the German fighter. The canopy shattered. The engine exploded. The Bf-190 rolled upside down and plunged toward the earth, trailing smoke. The other fighters immediately broke formation. They had expected an easy kill. Instead, they had found a determined escort pilot protecting the bomber. For the moment, the bomber was safe. But Howell knew the battle wasn't over. Not even close.
The sky above occupied France had grown strangely quiet. Only minutes earlier, it had been filled with cannon fire, exploding aircraft, and the deadly dance of fighters weaving through the bomber formation. Now, the air seemed almost calm. But the calm was deceptive. Inside the crippled B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 423067, the situation was becoming more desperate with every passing minute. The aircraft had already descended through 20,000 feet. First Lieutenant Robert Hayes kept both hands firmly on the control yoke, fighting the bomber's constant pull toward the earth. The sky above occupied France had grown strangely quiet. Only minutes earlier, it had been filled with cannon fire, exploding aircraft, and the deadly dance of fighters weaving through the bomber formation. Now, the air seemed almost calm. But the calm was deceptive. Inside the crippled B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 423067, the situation was becoming more desperate with every passing minute. The aircraft had already descended through 20,000 feet. First Lieutenant Robert Hayes kept both hands firmly on the control yoke, fighting the bomber's constant pull toward the earth. The damaged aircraft no longer felt like a graceful flying machine. It felt like a wounded animal, heavy, unstable, reluctant to stay in the sky. Beside him, co-pilot Frank Morrison kept scanning the instrument panel. Oil pressure, fuel levels, engine temperature, hydraulic pressure. Every needle seemed to be pointing toward disaster. Altitude 18,000, Morrison reported quietly. The bomber continued to sink. Hayes tried adjusting the trim tabs again, attempting to stabilize the aircraft's attitude, but the control surfaces responded sluggishly. Without hydraulic pressure, every movement required far more effort than normal. Behind them, in the radio room, Sergeant Mike Donnelly struggled to contain the leaking hydraulic fluid. The spray had slowed slightly, but the floor beneath the radio equipment was already slick with oil. Donnelly wiped his hands on a rag and stared at the growing puddle. "Hydraulics almost gone up here," he reported over the intercom. Hayes didn't respond. He already knew. The escort above. High above the wounded bomber, James Howell circled in a slow defensive pattern. His P-47 Thunderbolt moved in a protective S-shaped weave behind the bomber. From this position, he could watch the surrounding sky while also covering the bomber's vulnerable rear. His eyes moved constantly, left, right, above, below. Combat experience had taught him something important. The moment things seemed quiet, that was usually when the next attack began. He glanced down at his fuel gauge again. 42 minutes remaining. England was still far away. The bomber was moving painfully slow. Howell did the math quickly in his head. At their current speed, the B-17 would need almost 40 minutes to reach the English Channel, and that was assuming no further damage, assuming no more attacks. Both assumptions were dangerously optimistic. Still, Howell stayed in position. He had made a promise. Inside the fortress. In the belly of the aircraft, Sergeant Eddie Martinez struggled to remain conscious. The ball turret was the most dangerous position inside a B-17, even under normal circumstances. The gunner sat curled into a cramped spherical turret beneath the aircraft, surrounded by ammunition belts and twin machine guns. Now, Martinez was trying to operate those guns with a wounded shoulder. Every movement sent sharp waves of pain through his arm. Blood soaked through the sleeve of his flight suit. Above him, in the waist gun positions, Corporal Tommy Briggs had finally regained consciousness. His head throbbed from the earlier impact that had dented his helmet. He blinked several times, trying to clear his vision. The first thing he saw was the open sky rushing past through a jagged hole in the fuselage skin. Cold wind blasted into the aircraft. "What happened?" Briggs muttered. "You got knocked out," another gunner shouted back. Briggs slowly pulled himself upright and looked toward the wing. Black smoke streamed from the damaged engine. "Hell," he whispered. Trouble returns. Above the bomber, Howell suddenly stiffened in his seat. Movement. Far in the distance, tiny dark shapes approaching fast. He focused his eyes. 3 aircraft, then 4, then 5. More German fighters. A Vic formation of Bf-109s approaching head-on. They were flying at nearly the same altitude. That meant they had already spotted the damaged bomber. Howell's jaw tightened. The Germans likely radioed for reinforcements. A crippled bomber was valuable prey. Destroying it would mean another victory for the Luftwaffe. Howell rolled the Thunderbolt toward the approaching fighters. If they wanted the bomber, they would have to go through him. Head-on collision course. Inside the cockpit of the P-47, Howell pushed the throttle forward. The powerful radial engine roared. The fighter surged ahead. He aimed directly at the incoming formation. It was a tactic that required absolute nerve. 2 aircraft flying toward each other at high speed could close the distance in seconds. One mistake meant instant death. The German pilots saw the lone fighter approaching. At first, they held formation, 5 fighters against 1, but they also knew something else. This pilot had already shot down one of their comrades earlier in the battle. He wasn't inexperienced. At 3,000 yards, Howell opened fire. The long burst of tracer rounds streaked across the sky. The distance was too great for accurate hits, but that wasn't the point. The real goal was disruption. The German formation immediately broke apart. Fighters scattered in multiple directions to avoid the incoming bullets. The carefully organized attack pattern collapsed. Howell dove beneath the formation, then rolled upside down. Pulling hard on the stick, he brought the fighter up behind one of the trailing Bf-109s. He fired again. Several rounds struck the German aircraft. Smoke poured from its engine. The pilot immediately banked away and dove toward the clouds. But 2 more fighters were already moving to attack the bomber. A desperate defense. Inside the B-17's tail section, Sergeant Walt Kendrick spotted the approaching fighters first. "Bandits! 6 o'clock!" He swung the twin 50 caliber machine guns toward the target. The guns rattled loudly as he fired. Tracer rounds streaked past the attacking fighters, but only 4 rounds. Click. Silence. The guns jammed. Kendrick cursed loudly and slammed his hand against the weapon. "Not now! Not now!" He desperately tried clearing the jam. Meanwhile, the German fighters continued closing in. Inside the cockpit, Hayes heard the call over the intercom. "Tail guns down!" Hayes felt his stomach tighten. Without the tail guns, the bomber's most vulnerable direction was completely exposed. But suddenly, the roar of machine guns filled the sky again. Howell had seen the danger. He pulled the Thunderbolt into a brutal high G turn. The force pushed him hard into his seat. His vision darkened at the edges. Still, he forced the aircraft around. The P-47 wasn't known for tight turns. It was a heavy fighter, but in skilled hands, it could still fight. Howell lined up the nearest Bf-109. Distance closed rapidly. 800 yards, 600, 400. He squeezed the trigger. The P-47's 8 machine guns erupted again.
The stream of bullets ripped across the German fighter's wing root. The wing tore away instantly under the enormous aerodynamic stress. The aircraft flipped violently, then vanished into the clouds below. The remaining fighters broke off their attack, for now. Temporary silence. Inside the bomber, the crew exhaled in relief. "Whoever that fighter is," Briggs muttered, "I owe him a drink." Hayes keyed his radio. "Jersey 27, you just saved our lives." Howell didn't answer immediately. He was staring at his fuel gauge again. 28 minutes remaining. The channel was still 65 miles away. The numbers were becoming frighteningly tight. Finally, he pressed the radio switch. "You're still not home yet, big friend." The bomber continued descending, 16,000 feet. The sky ahead was growing darker. Clouds gathered along the horizon, and somewhere out there, more German fighters were surely preparing their next attack. Howell knew the worst might still be ahead, but he stayed with the bomber, because some promises were not meant to be broken.
The crippled B-17 Flying Fortress continued its slow, painful descent through the gray skies of occupied France. Altitude, 16,000 feet. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes could feel every vibration running through the aircraft's frame. The bomber was no longer flying smoothly, it shuddered constantly. The damaged engines struggled to maintain even minimal power, and the wind howled through the holes torn into the aluminum fuselage. Hayes adjusted the controls again, fighting the aircraft's natural tendency to roll toward the dead engine. Every correction required strength. Without proper hydraulic pressure, the controls felt heavy and unresponsive. Beside him, Frank Morrison kept scanning the instrument panel. The readings told a grim story. Oil pressure dropping, fuel imbalance between the tanks, hydraulic pressure nearly gone. Worst of all, the aircraft was still losing altitude at nearly 200 feet per minute. "We're not holding this much longer," Morrison muttered quietly. Hayes didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both understood the situation. Howell's vigil. Above the bomber, James Howell continued weaving his P-47 Thunderbolt back and forth in a defensive pattern. The fighter's massive radial engine thundered steadily as he scanned the sky. His eyes moved constantly. Combat had taught him that danger could appear from anywhere, especially when protecting a damaged bomber. He checked the fuel gauge again. 23 minutes remaining. The channel was still far away. If he stayed much longer, he might not make it back. Howell leaned forward slightly in the cockpit. "Come on, just hold together," he murmured quietly, looking down at the struggling bomber. Descending through the clouds. The bomber passed through another thin cloud layer. For a moment, the world disappeared into white mist. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Inside the cockpit, Hayes focused on his instruments: artificial horizon, altimeter, airspeed indicator. The aircraft continued drifting downward. 15,000 feet, 14,000. Finally, the bomber emerged beneath the clouds again. Clear air surrounded them, but the brief concealment had also hidden something else, something approaching: reinforcements. Howell saw them first. 6 dark shapes appeared high above the bomber. They were descending rapidly. 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, perfect attack formation. They had been called in by radio. This time, the Germans weren't testing defenses. They were here to finish the job. Howell's heart rate jumped instantly. 6 against 1. Not good odds, but he pushed the throttle forward anyway. The P-47's engine roared, propeller blades biting aggressively into the thin air. Howell pulled the fighter upward toward the incoming formation. If they reached the bomber untouched, it would be over. The intercept. The German fighters began diving toward the bomber. Their formation was precise, professional, deadly. Howell pointed his aircraft directly at them, head-on. Two formations now raced toward each other at terrifying speed, closing velocity over 500 knots. Inside the German cockpits, several pilots noticed the lone American fighter approaching. One fighter against 6, but something about the attack made them hesitate. This was the same pilot who had already shot down 2 of their comrades, and he was flying straight at them. At 1,200 yards, Howell opened fire. 8 machine guns roared. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky. The bullets weren't meant to hit. They were meant to force the Germans to react, and it worked. The lead fighter abruptly veered right to avoid the incoming fire. The perfect attack formation instantly collapsed. 2 fighters broke left, 2 went right. The remaining pair continued downward. Exactly what Howell wanted. Divide them, fight them separately. The first kill. Howell dove underneath the scattered fighters and rolled sharply. He lined up behind the rightmost Bf-109. Distance closed rapidly. 600 yards, 400, 300. He squeezed the trigger. The Thunderbolt's guns thundered again. The stream of bullets tore directly through the German fighter's tail section. Metal exploded outward. The aircraft pitched violently upward before entering a spin. It tumbled downward toward the clouds below. Another kill. But the fight wasn't over. 5 fighters still remained. Attack on the bomber. 2 of the Bf-109s ignored Howell completely. They dove straight toward the bomber from the rear. Inside the bomber, tail gunner Walt Kendrick finally managed to clear the jam in his machine guns. The moment the charging fighters appeared in his sights, he fired. The twin 50 caliber guns roared. Tracer rounds filled the air. One of the German fighters took several hits. White smoke burst from its engine cowling. The pilot immediately pulled up and broke away. But the second fighter continued its attack. Its 20mm cannons flashed. Explosive shells streaked toward the bomber. Inside the cockpit, Hayes heard the impact instantly. Thump, thump, thump. The entire aircraft shuddered. "Left wing hit," Morrison shouted. A shell slammed into fuel tank number 2. Fortunately, the tank was nearly empty, but the remaining vapors ignited instantly. Flames burst from the wing. "Fire!" Morrison yelled. Without hesitation, he grabbed the engine fire suppression handle. He pulled it. Pressurized CO2 flooded the engine compartment. For several terrifying seconds, the flames continued burning. Then, slowly, they faded. The fire was out, but the damage was catastrophic. The number 2 engine had been destroyed. Its propeller seized completely. The bomber now flew on only 2 engines out of 4. Losing altitude fast. The effect was immediate. The aircraft rolled violently toward the dead engines. Hayes struggled to keep the bomber level. The drag from the damaged wing pulled them downward faster than ever. Altitude dropped through 11,000 feet. The descent rate increased, 300 feet per minute, 400. "Skipper," Morrison said urgently, "we have to bail out now." Hayes stared forward. The channel was still ahead. They weren't over Germany anymore. If they could just reach the water, maybe they had a chance. "Not yet," Hayes said firmly. "Jersey's still with us." Howell's dogfight. Meanwhile, Howell was fighting for his life. The remaining German fighters had turned their attention toward him. The sky filled with twisting aircraft. Machine gun fire flashed everywhere. A burst of cannon shells struck Howell's Thunderbolt. One round slammed into the left wing. Another struck the armor plate behind the cockpit. The heavy armor absorbed the impact. Without it, Howell would have been killed instantly. He pushed the aircraft harder. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful, but it was tough. Howell rolled behind another Bf-109. The German pilot tried to break away. Too late. Howell fired a short burst. The bullets streaked across the German fighter's wing. The aircraft exploded into a brief orange fireball. Debris scattered across the sky. The remaining German pilots finally made a decision.
They had already lost several aircraft trying to destroy a single bomber. Their fuel was running low. The fight wasn't worth it anymore. One by one, the fighters turned east and disappeared toward Germany. Brief relief. Howell exhaled slowly. He scanned the sky again. Empty. For now. Howell rolled the P-47 back toward the bomber. The B-17 was now descending through 9,000 feet. Black smoke trailed behind it, like a long black scar across the sky. Howell looked at his fuel gauge again. 11 minutes remaining. The English Channel was still 28 miles away. At the bomber's slow speed, that meant 18 minutes of flight time. 7 minutes too long. Howell pressed the radio switch. "Big friend, I'm going to have to leave you soon." There was a long pause. Inside the bomber cockpit, Hayes closed his eyes briefly. "Understood, Jersey," he finally replied. "You've done enough. Head home." Howell looked down at the crippled bomber, then back at his fuel gauge. "Negative," he said quietly. "I'll stay with you as long as I can." Inside the bomber, Morrison shook his head. "He's going to crash trying to save us." Hayes knew it too. The math was simple. If Howell stayed until they reached the channel, his fighter would run out of fuel over enemy territory. He would either crash or become a prisoner of war. But Howell had already made his choice. He continued flying beside the bomber. 2 aircraft, one barely able to stay in the air, the other slowly running out of fuel, both racing toward the distant water of the English Channel. And the worst part of the journey was still ahead.
The gray waters of the English Channel stretched endlessly beneath the crippled B-17 Flying Fortress. Altitude, 5,000 feet. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes knew the truth now. They would not reach England. Even reaching the middle of the channel would be difficult. With only 2 functioning engines and severe structural damage, the aircraft was barely staying in the air. Beside him, Frank Morrison studied the instruments again. The numbers confirmed everything. "We're losing altitude faster now," he said quietly. The bomber continued descending. 4,500 feet. 4,000. Hayes took a slow breath. "Prepare the crew," he said. Morrison nodded and pressed the intercom switch. "Crew, this is the co-pilot. Prepare for ditching." For a moment, no one spoke. Every man inside the aircraft understood what those words meant. They were about to crash into the ocean. Howell's final minutes. Above the bomber, James Howell checked his fuel gauge again. The needle rested almost completely on empty. 3 minutes remaining. The engine coughed once. A warning. He switched fuel tanks, hoping to squeeze the last drops from the system. For a moment, the engine steadied again. Below him, the B-17 continued descending slowly toward the water. Howell eased the fighter down beside the bomber, flying almost wing to wing with the massive aircraft. The 2 machines looked strangely peaceful now. One huge bomber and one lone fighter. Both wounded, both nearly out of time. Preparing for impact. Inside the bomber, Morrison continued reading the emergency checklist. "Crew, assume crash positions." In the tail section, Sergeant Walt Kendrick tightened the straps of his harness. In the radio room, Mike Donnelly braced himself against the bulkhead. In the waist gun positions, Tawny Briggs and the other gunners secured themselves between equipment racks. In the ball turret, Eddie Martinez tried desperately to climb out. The ball turret was a death trap during a water landing. If the aircraft sank quickly, anyone trapped inside would drown. Pain shot through his wounded shoulder as he struggled to pull himself upward, but he kept climbing. The ocean was coming closer every second. Howell loses power. Altitude, 2,000 feet. Howell's engine coughed again. this time longer. The sound every pilot feared: fuel starvation. The powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine sputtered twice more. Then, silence. The propeller continued spinning in the wind, but the engine was dead. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become a glider, an 8-ton glider. Howell immediately pushed the nose downward slightly to maintain airspeed. Too slow, and the aircraft would stall. Too fast, and the impact would destroy the fighter completely. He glanced once more at the bomber beside him. "See you in the water, big friend," he whispered. The ditching. Altitude, 1,000 feet. Inside the bomber, Hayes lined the aircraft into the wind. This would reduce ground speed during impact. He pulled the control yoke slightly backward. The bomber's nose rose gently. Airspeed dropped, 120 knots. The ocean rushed up toward them. Then, the B-17 struck the water. The impact was violent. The entire aircraft slammed against the waves with a thunderous crash. Metal screamed. Rivets popped loose. The bomber skipped once across the surface, then again. Huge walls of water exploded around the aircraft. Inside the fuselage, crew members were thrown forward against their restraints. Equipment ripped loose from the walls. The aircraft finally settled heavily into the sea and began sliding forward through the water. Then it stopped and immediately began sinking. Escape. "Everybody out!" Hayes shouted. Water was already pouring through dozens of cracks in the fuselage. The crew scrambled toward the escape hatches. Morrison kicked open the cockpit hatch and climbed out onto the wing. He pulled Hayes up after him. The bomber leaned heavily to the left as water filled the damaged sections of the aircraft. They had maybe 2 minutes before it sank. Crew members jumped from the wings into the freezing water. Emergency life rafts inflated automatically as they hit the sea. Howell's crash. 200 yards away, Howell fought to control the powerless Thunderbolt. The fighter descended quickly toward the waves. Without engine power, the aircraft handled poorly. At 90 knots, the P-47 hit the water nose first. The massive engine drove downward like an anchor. The aircraft flipped forward violently. Howell slammed against the instrument panel. Pain exploded across his forehead. Blood ran down into his eyes. Water rushed into the cockpit instantly. The aircraft began sinking fast. Howell struggled to release the canopy. His fingers were already going numb from the freezing water. Finally, the canopy release handle moved. The canopy separated. Water surged in. Howell forced himself upward and out of the cockpit. A moment later, the Thunderbolt disappeared beneath the waves. Survival. Howell surfaced, gasping for air. The water was brutally cold. Every breath felt like knives in his chest. He inflated his Mae West life vest and began swimming toward the bomber crew. His heavy flight boots dragged him down with every stroke, but he kept swimming. Finally, he reached one of the life rafts. Hands grabbed him and pulled him aboard. He collapsed into the raft, shaking violently from the cold. Above him, Hayes leaned over. "You crazy bastard," Hayes said, smiling weakly. "You actually did it." Howell tried to speak, but his teeth were chattering too badly. Counting the survivors. The men quickly counted heads. 8 men in the first raft, 3 in the second, 11 total. But something was wrong. Hayes looked around. "Where's Martinez?" No one answered. Finally, Donnelly spoke quietly. "He didn't make it out of the ball turret." The men fell silent. 9 men saved, 1 lost. The brutal mathematics of war. Rescue. The survivors floated in the freezing water for 18 minutes. 18 minutes that felt like hours. Some men prayed, Some stared silently at the gray sky. Finally, on the horizon, a shape appeared, a small RAF rescue launch speeding toward them. When the British sailors pulled the survivors aboard, Hayes pointed toward Howell. "This man stayed with us the whole way," Hayes said. "He fought off enemy fighters for 90 miles, ran out of fuel, and ditched beside us." The British captain looked at Howell, who was still shivering under a blanket. He nodded slowly. "Well done, Yank," he said. "Well done." After the war. 3 days later, James Howell received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. The surviving bomber crew attended the ceremony. Years later, Hayes described the moment in an interview. "We were dead," he said. "We all knew it. Then this fighter pilot decided we weren't dying that day." After the war, Howell returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke about his service, but every Christmas until his death in 1998, he received letters and cards from the families of the men he had saved. 9 lives, 1 decision, a moment that defined what true courage looked like. Because sometimes heroism isn't about victory. Sometimes it's simply about refusing to leave your brothers behind.